Finally, we have Professor David Scott Hamnes, who is assistant professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology's Institute for Music in Trondheim, Norway. Originally from Australia, Professor Hamnes comes to us as a representative of the Internationale Arbeitgemeinschaft für Hymnologie. His research interests include the development of the hymn in the 21st century, ecumenical hymn studies, and Nordic liturgical practice.
Good morning, everyone. Filled of glede. We'll try once more. Filled of glede. Over livets under. That's enough for now. We'll get on to the next part afterwards. I'm going to talk about Svein Ellingsen. Svein Ellingsen is probably the most important poet, hymn writer that we have had in the last 50 years in the Nordic region. I have the last of the three sectionals, or short meters today, and it's shortly lunch. And I'm sure you're all hungry, but we're going to do a bit of singing. We're going to learn a little bit about the translation processes and a little about Ellingsen. Ellingsen we know from a number of different hymn books already. But why is he so important? He was an artist, a teacher, a writer, a poet, a translator, and he's best known for his central hymns on baptism, on communion, the Christian community, and perhaps most of all, on sorrow, loss, sickness, despair, usually from an eschatological perspective. He challenges, on the other hand, Danish Adolf Brorson as the chief hymn writer for the season of Christmas, and his hymns are full of hope. But his writings rarely carried by that buoyant, light-hearted jubilation. His use of succinct language and stable metrical forms and rhythmic foundations show a simplicity of style influenced by Norwegian and Nordic modernist poets such as Arnulf Øverland and Gunvor Hofmo. Ellingsen typically avoids metaphor, inversion, esoteric complexity, even rhyme. Pompous purple prose is anathema. His metaphor and his hymns are known and loved by two generations of Norwegian Lutherans, and it's often been said that his hymns are sung from the pew rather than preached from the pulpit. He himself has stated that his aim is the same as Magnus Brostrup Landstad said in 1870, lend words to the people of the church. He is sober, but not somber, solid, yet not stolid. He recognized this and has been recognized as an important hymnologist, writer, and has received a number of awards, which I'm sure those that are interested can investigate. Only recently, his last hymn, written in 2009, Hymnologie, which is a jubilant Easter hymn, it is unusually for Ellingsen crammed with citations from Easter hymns past and present. He himself citates Ellingsen. It's included in the database which I spoke about yesterday. And now for slide number 2. Ellingsen was a translator as well, and he introduced us to Danish hymns such as Når tænder vi vor adventskrans, an Advent hymn which gained him widespread popularity in the 1970s, as well as hymns by the Swede Anders Frostenson and hymns by Englishman George Woodward, This Joyful Easter Tide, Christina Rossetti, In the Bleak Midwinter, and Johann Frank, Schmucke dich, O liebe Seele. And Ellingsen has played a central role in compilations of hymn books in the last 50 years. Most significantly, he was on the committee with many other influential musicians for Norsk Salmeleksikon in 1985. And he's been translated into Danish, Swedish, Icelandic and Finnish, naturally enough, but also into German and to English, and his hymns are found across the Northern Hemisphere. And there are indications that his hymns are also found in Hungarian and Polish, and as I'm in the process of compiling a complete list of translations, I'll find more about this later, but today I'm just going to discuss the English and the German translations. Now, Ellingsen didn't like the word translation. He preferred gjendiktning, or retelling. All those who have translated another writer's works have struggled both with the concepts and the contents from another culture and language area. Just one word at a time, each choice in turn, and one changes the entirety of an original expression. The text becomes another, transformed, even renewed. In other words, translation can never be merely concordant for it to function. It must be dynamic so that meaning becomes clear. And every translator must use their own vocabulary to retain their identity as a translator, their own modes of expression, and their own understandings of present reality. If you just ask your neighbour what they mean by dinner time, you'll get my drift. Additionally, as C.S. Lewis, whom we've met already today, comments in God in the Dock, if we are to have translation at all, we must have periodic retranslation. You can't translate something once and for all and be done with it. Language is a changing thing and changing all the time at a staggering pace. Every generation has the obligation to retell, and every translator must take liberties to achieve coherence. And during this process, something will be gained, something lost. And every translation is one possibility amongst many. Absolutism gives way to essentialism. Early translation work by Jürgen Henkes was done in the 1970s and paved the way for English translations, which came later. IAH in the hymn books Unisono and Colours of Grace, and many Austrian, German, and Swiss hymnals include Ellingsen texts. Hedwig Dürnbau from the States and Austria has published a number of significant translations, and two of her Ellingsen translations are found in the Evangelical Lutheran Worship, Seed That on Earth is Dying, and We Raise Our Hands to You. Her hymn book, or rather collection of Ellingsen translations, Praises Resound, which led to wider dissemination of Ellingsen throughout the world, was published in 1991 by my friend and colleague Olga Horvig. And Gracia Grindal, also from Minneapolis, has published many significant translations of Ellingsen, and some of these are included in the Church of Norway's Hymns in English, which also is used in other countries. Ivan Chetwynd, a retired pastor in the Methodist Church in Norway, has published English translations, and the following table on slides 3 to 6 shows an overview of the most widely known translations in English and German. But note, the translation work is ongoing. It started around about 1977, and the last translation in English is from 2019. Some hymns have been translated many times, others just once or twice. Some are translated with new tunes, others retain the original Nordic or Norwegian tune. I'm going to talk about the hymn which we have learned the first line, the Initium, Fyldt av glede over livets under. And this has 4 translations. The first from 1982 with Jürgen Henkes, and followed quite shortly after by the Swiss Catholic writer Friedrich Hoffmann in 1983. Hedwig's translation, Filled with Joy and Gladness at Life's Wonder, which you'll note is almost identical, and Gracia Grindal's Filled with Gladness as we pour this water, which is more dynamic. Other texts which have received several translations include Noen må våke i verdens natt, Vi bader mange med oss, and Sammen for Guds ansikt, which was used as the Olympic hymn in 1994. Now, if we go on to slide number 7, we'll see the first tune with the entire text of the first verse. This tune by Knut Nystedt, who's a composer many will know, is not anymore in use. Let's practice that first line again. Fyldt av glede. Over livets under. Med et nyfødt barn. i våre hender kommer vi til deg som gav oss livet. You can sort of understand what's going on here. I think most of the words are derived from Old English, Old Norse, and there is a certain similarity in the language order, word order altogether. Not particularly difficult to understand for German speakers either. Ellingsen wrote this hymn in 1971, and he said it came about when our third child was on the way, and considering the joyous day when we're carrying it to baptism. Published in 1973, and in a hymn book which turns 50 next year. The text is without rhyme. It opens and closes with the same words. The first three stanzas have a parallel inisia, filled with joy, filled with fear, filled with wonder. And it's divided into two, where the first half is reflecting the family of the baptized child, and the second half reflects on the results of the baptismal ceremony. The division of the text is no longer found in the hymn book, but in some German texts this is actually present. The perspective is from infant baptism, and it is Ellingsen's by far most popular hymn. Sacramental realism is present in it, and a taste of the mystical realism which he finds in the translation of Frank's Schmuckerdich is also there, with the anthropological and mystical meet in faith and action. It's only 3 lines, and you'll note that the melody is also in 3 lines in the first version. The later tune, which we will sing, is much more sensible because it has 4 lines, 4 bars in each, and it follows every rule in the book. The second tune by Peter Møller is also like the first in 3 lines. Let's have a look at that one. In Denmark, typically in a Danish traditional style, it has a dissemination down there, but nowhere near as popular as the tune by Egil Hovland, which came in 1974. It requires the repetition of the last line in each stanza, and it gives that satisfying 4-phrase structure. Let's sing it in Norwegian. Let's go to the next slide. Most impressed with your Norwegian. Excellent work. The tune by Linus David in the Swiss Catholic and Protestant hymn books is in the Gaudemel French Renaissance style and gives the hymn an entirely different flavour. All 4 tunes which we've met today can be used with each translation, and few texts that I know of have achieved this form of value confirmation through composer recognition. There's certainly room for more. In the Swedish tradition, you'll note in the next slide from the Swedish hymn book, Med vår glädje, we have a slightly different initium, and this is a fact which I think should be carried forward in the translations which we are going to meet. A lot of translators find that they want to retain inisia and the word order and as much as possible of the contents of the original. This is sometimes successful, many times less so. In the next slides, you'll see the translations into German by Hoffmann and Henkes. In Henkes' 1982 translation, we'll find a concordant and dynamic translation which uses some of the original theology and also develops it. The bange, or fear, in the second stanza turns into the positive unerschrocken, or fearless, in the 6th stanza, and linguistically completes the theological meaning of baptism. This is not present in Ellingsen's text. The limitless universe, the temporality and creation, which are underlined in stanzas 3 and 4, are also in Ellingsen, but given a greater and wider perspective. He manages to include the first and last phrases in a short completing form, volle Freude. Short, concise sentences, particularly un-German, and the clear and precise meanings are actually carried forward. No additional metaphors, uses arms rather than hands. In Hoffmann's translation, on the other hand, we find that he also uses the initium, using dunkel rather than unbekannten, the unknown, dark rather than unknown, hands as in the original, created life rather than gave us life, the nearness is felt rather than heard, which we find in Henkes, baptism and the candles shine onwards into death, taking the baptismal candle metaphor a step further. Hoffmann uses longer sentences, colons and semicolons, and creates a more complex translation form which sits better with the German language. He also uses the first and last phrases in a completing form, and only one verse contains more than one sentence. Clear and precise, but less concise than Henkes. If we can sing that text by Henkes on the next slide, I think I'll challenge you to do the German. The English translations, starting with Hedda Dürnbau's concordant translation, sometimes obscured by language and grammar, which are almost identically in word order to the original. Dürnbau's concordant translation has inconsistent temporality, and the language, especially in verses 1 and 2, where in our hands a newborn child presenting, come we now to you who life have given, creates a rather convoluted dialogue. Retaining the first initium in the 3 stanzas, the concordance gets in the way of the meaning. The result is a little stilted, and inverted language creates further complexity. Some metrical problems also occur in verses 2 and 3. Interestingly, Dürnbau's translation may have inspired a hymn by Daniel Merrick entitled Filled with the Joy and Gladness of Life's Wonder. Interesting, which I found just by searching the title. Gracia Grindal's translation on the right-hand side is a paraphrased, more dynamic translation. The parents' hands are not mentioned, but rather generalized. Into your keeping we give this child. Imperfect rhymes, on the other hand, challenge the simplicity of Ellingsen's original text. We have future and nurture, wonder, tended. Eschatological time is altered to the more oblique Jordan River in verse 5 on the next slide. And both Grindal and Dürnbau use incorrectly metrical accents on certain words, which are less successful. We have, in other words, a translation, a possible renewal of these 2 translations, which I hope will be a result of your introduction to this. Producing translation and producing prose is relatively straightforward, but perceiving the poetic side of literature, both receptive and creative, is quite another matter. As a rule, there are 3 main characteristics that should be recognized. the characteristics on which the theological contours of the text depend, the poetic characteristics, and the character of the musical setting. That last characteristic is not necessarily anything but a dynamic one. We can always write new music. In other words, one must deal with the challenging interplay of statement, language form, and accessibility. Tunes are an integral part of any well-loved hymn, and as this text shows, any number of tunes can aid in dissemination. Ellingsen's succinct language, rhythm, and metre meld together in an effortless simplicity of style, avoiding metaphor, inversion, esoteric complexity, even rhyme. Much might be gained from an examination of these characteristics. While Ellingsen's already accessible, these and other texts have much to offer both to congregation and to translator, and in the same way that Ellingsen has enriched the Norwegian hymnology through his central texts in translation by Woodward, Frank, and Rossetti and Lissner, new translations of Ellingsen's poetic writing may inspire coming generations to discover both more of the present and more of the past. I wish you all a fabulous morning filled with joy and in celebration of all baptismal promises.